The autumn mist clung to the red clay roads of Fairwood like a shroud, carrying with it the whispered prayers of a community gripped by fear. Reverend Thomas Whitmore pulled his black coat tighter as he walked through the town square, his weathered Bible pressed against his chest. The year 1849 had brought more than just another harsh winter to rural Georgia. It had brought something far more sinister. "Reverend," called out Martha Henley, her voice barely above a whisper as she approached from the general store. Her face was pale, drawn with the kind of exhaustion that came from sleepless nights. "Have you heard? The Caldwell boy. He's been missing for 3 days now." Thomas nodded grimly. Young Samuel Caldwell was the 4th person to vanish in as many weeks, all of them last seen heading toward the outskirts of town, where the Godfrey property lay hidden among the towering pines and Spanish moss. The very mention of that name sent a chill through the God-fearing people of Fairwood. "Mrs. Henley," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the unease churning in his stomach, "have you spoken to Sheriff Morrison about this matter?" Martha's eyes darted nervously around the square before she leaned closer. "The sheriff? He won't go near that place, Reverend. Says there ain't no law against what consenting adults do on their own property." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. But we both know it ain't just consenting adults anymore, don't we?" The Godfrey sisters had arrived in Fairwood 2 years prior, purchasing the old Blackwood estate with gold coins that gleamed too bright in the Georgia sun. Eleanor, the eldest at 28, possessed raven black hair that cascaded down her back like a waterfall of sin. Margaret, 25, had eyes the color of emeralds that seemed to see straight through a person's soul. And Ruth, the youngest at 22, carried herself with a grace that made even the most devout men stumble over their prayers. From the moment they set foot in town, strange things began to happen. Married men would disappear for days, returning home with hollow eyes and lips sealed tight about their experiences. Women, too, found themselves drawn to the mysterious sisters, abandoning their households and children for nights that stretched into dawn. "Reverend Whitmore," came another voice from behind. Dr. Edmund Hayes approached, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. The doctor's usually composed demeanor was cracked, revealing the strain of recent events. "I need to speak with you privately." The three moved to the shadow of the old oak tree that dominated the town square, its gnarled branches reaching toward the gray sky like arthritic fingers. Dr. Hayes glanced around nervously before speaking. "I've been called to examine situations involving people who've returned from the Godfrey property," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "The physical evidence I've documented, it defies medical explanation. Marks on their bodies that suggest practices I dare not speak aloud, and a strange pallor to their skin, as if something vital has been drained from them." Martha crossed herself. "What kind of marks, Doctor?" Dr. Hayes shook his head. "The kind that would make a grown man weep, Mrs. Henley." "But that's not the worst of it." He paused, gathering courage. "Yesterday I was called to examine young Mary Patterson after she returned from that place. She was barely conscious, speaking in tongues I'd never heard before. But what troubled me most was what she kept repeating in her lucid moments." "What did she say?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "She kept saying, 'The dead dance with the living, and the living become the dead.'" Dr. Hayes's voice cracked. "Reverend, I fear we're dealing with something beyond the realm of medicine or even conventional sin." As if summoned by their conversation, a figure emerged from the mist at the far end of the square. It was Eleanor Godfrey herself, moving with that unnaturally fluid grace that had captivated so many. She wore a deep burgundy dress that seemed to absorb the pale afternoon light, and her dark eyes swept across the three gathered figures with an intensity that made them all step back involuntarily. "Good afternoon, Reverend," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying an accent that seemed to shift between southern drawl and something more exotic. "Dr. Hayes, Mrs. Henley." She nodded to each in turn, her lips curving into a smile that revealed teeth too white and too sharp. "Miss Godfrey," Thomas replied stiffly, his hand instinctively moving to the cross hanging from his neck. Eleanor's gaze lingered on the gesture, and her smile widened. "I do hope you'll all join us for our gathering this evening. We're expecting quite a resurrection of spirits." The way she emphasized the word resurrection sent ice through their veins. Without waiting for a response, she continued her glide through the square, leaving behind only the faint scent of jasmine and something else. Something that reminded Dr. Hayes uncomfortably of the morgue. "Did you see her shadow?" Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. The three looked back at where Eleanor had passed, and Thomas felt his blood run cold. In the fading afternoon light, where her shadow should have been, there was nothing but empty ground. As evening approached, the people of Fairwood shuttered their windows and barred their doors, but despite their fears, despite their prayers, they knew that some among them would still find themselves drawn to the Godfrey estate when darkness fell. And come morning, the town would count its missing, wondering who would return changed and who would never return at all. In the distance, beyond the pine trees and Spanish moss, the old Blackwood estate waited in the gathering darkness, its windows glowing with a light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Sheriff William Morrison sat in his office as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the wooden floors of the jailhouse. The bottle of whiskey on his desk was already half empty, though the evening had barely begun. He'd taken to drinking more heavily since the Godfrey sisters arrived, finding it the only way to silence the memories that clawed at the edges of his mind. The door creaked open, and Deputy James Crawford stepped inside, his young face etched with concern. At 23, James still possessed the idealism that Morrison had lost somewhere along the way. "Sheriff, we've got reports of people heading out toward the Godfrey place again," James said, removing his hat and running his fingers through his sandy hair. "The widow Thompson, old Mr. Garrison, and—" he hesitated, "and my own sister, Sarah." Morrison looked up from his glass, his bloodshot eyes focusing on his deputy. "How old is Sarah now, boy?" 19, sir. "But she's been acting strange lately, talking about dreams, about voices calling to her." James's voice cracked slightly. "Sheriff, what exactly happens out there?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring into the amber liquid in his glass. He'd been to the Godfrey estate once, 3 months ago, when the first complaints started rolling in. What he'd witnessed there had shattered something fundamental in his understanding of the world. "James," Morrison said finally, his voice hoarse, "there are some things a man ain't meant to see. Some things that change you just by witnessing them. But sir, people are disappearing. And the ones who come back—" James trailed off, remembering the hollow-eyed shells of people who'd returned from the estate, forever changed by their experiences. Morrison stood abruptly, swaying slightly from the whiskey. "You want to know what happens out there, Deputy? You want to understand why I won't set foot on that cursed ground again?" James nodded, though something in the sheriff's tone made him want to flee. "I went there on a Tuesday night in July," Morrison began, his voice taking on the cadence of a man recounting a nightmare. "Followed the screams and the sounds. Found maybe 30 people from our town, naked as the day they were born, writhing together in ways that would make the devil himself blush." He moved to the window, staring out toward the distant tree line where the Godfrey property lay hidden. "But that wasn't the worst of it, James. The worst was what I saw in the center of it all." "What did you see, Sheriff?" Morrison's reflection in the window looked like a ghost. "Bodies, James. Dead bodies. Corpses pulled from their graves, positioned among the living like they were part of the festivities. And the Godfrey sisters, they were orchestrating it all, moving between the living and the dead like there was no difference between them." James felt his stomach lurch. "That's impossible, sir. The dead can't..." "Can't what?" Morrison spun around, his eyes wild. Can't move, can't participate. Tell that to old Mrs. Brennan, who's been dead and buried for 6 months but was dancing with her own widower that night. Tell that to the Confederate soldiers who've been rotting in the ground since the war ended, but were there, participating in acts so vile I can't speak them aloud. The deputy sank into a chair, his face pale. How is that possible? I don't know, and I don't want to know, Morrison said, returning to his desk and pouring another drink. All I know is that the Godfrey sisters have brought something to Fairwood that shouldn't exist, something that makes the dead walk and the living lose their souls. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Hayes entered without waiting for permission, his face grim and his clothes disheveled. Sheriff, I need to report another incident, the doctor said, setting his medical bag down heavily. Young Timothy Walsh returned from the Godfrey estate an hour ago. His family brought him to me because he was different. Different how? James asked, though he dreaded the answer. Dr. Hayes pulled out a small notebook, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. Physically, he appears unharmed, but his body temperature is abnormally low, almost corpse-like. His pulse is barely detectable, and his eyes... The doctor paused, struggling to find the words. His eyes are completely black, no iris or pupil visible, and he keeps asking for his deceased mother, claiming she's waiting for him at the estate. Morrison slammed his glass down on the desk. His mother died in childbirth 20 years ago. That's what makes this so disturbing, Dr. Hayes continued. Timothy insists he spoke with her, touched her, that she told him secrets about the afterlife. He's begging his family to let him return to the estate, saying the dead have so much to teach the living. The three men sat in heavy silence, each grappling with the implications of what they were hearing. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of laughter and music from the direction of the Godfrey property. There's something else, Dr. Hayes said quietly. I've been keeping records of everyone who's visited the estate. The pattern is becoming clear. Those who go once always return, and each time they come back, they're a little less human. James stood up abruptly. I have to go after Sarah. I can't let her become like the others. Morrison grabbed the young deputy's arm. You step foot on that property, boy, and you'll never be the same. I've seen good men go in there and come out as something else entirely. Then what do you suggest we do? James demanded. Just let them continue this abomination. Before Morrison could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from outside. Through the window, they could see a procession of townspeople walking slowly down the main street, their movements synchronized and unnatural. At the front of the group walked Margaret Godfrey, her emerald eyes glowing in the moonlight. They're collecting tonight's congregation, Dr. Hayes whispered, his voice filled with horror. Among the walking figures, James spotted his sister Sarah, her face blank and her eyes reflecting the same unnatural light as Margaret's. Behind her walked others, the baker's wife, the school teacher, even old Judge Hartwell, all moving with the same eerie synchronization. But what made James's blood run cold was the realization that interspersed among the living were figures he recognized from the town cemetery, people who had been dead for months, even years, walking alongside the living as if death were merely an inconvenience. My God, Morrison breathed, they're not just corrupting the living anymore, they're raising the dead to join their unholy congregation. As the procession passed the jailhouse, Margaret Godfrey turned her head toward the window where the three men stood watching. Her lips curved into that same predatory smile, and she raised one pale hand in a mockery of a blessing. The message was clear. No one in Fairwood was beyond their reach, not the living, and certainly not the dead. Reverend Thomas Whitmore knelt in the sanctuary of his small church, his knees aching against the hard wooden floor as he prayed for guidance. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the altar, but even the holy light seemed dimmed by the darkness that had settled over Fairwood. The church doors creaked open, and Thomas looked up to see Mrs. Elizabeth Caldwell stumbling inside, her clothes torn and her face streaked with dirt and tears. She was the mother of Samuel, the boy who had disappeared 3 days prior. "Reverend," she gasped, collapsing into the front pew. "I found him. I found my Samuel." Thomas rose quickly, moving to comfort the distraught woman. "Where is he, Mrs. Caldwell? Is he safe?" Elizabeth's laugh was sharp and bitter, tinged with madness. "Safe? Oh, Reverend, he's beyond safe now. He's beyond everything." Her eyes, wild and unfocused, met his. "I found him in the cemetery, Reverend. In the cemetery, dancing with the dead." The blood drained from Thomas's face. "What do you mean, dancing with the dead?" "I went looking for him at dawn when the mist was thick," Elizabeth continued, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that chilled Thomas to the bone. "I followed the sounds, the music, the laughter, and there, in our own cemetery, I saw them all." She stood abruptly, beginning to pace in front of the altar. "The Godfrey sisters had turned our sacred ground into their playground, Reverend. The graves were open, empty holes in the earth like hungry mouths, and the bodies were dancing." Thomas felt his legs weaken. "Mrs. Caldwell, perhaps you were mistaken. The morning mist can play tricks." "No tricks!" she screamed, spinning to face him. "I saw my Samuel, my beautiful boy, locked in an embrace with old Mrs. Patterson, who's been dead for 2 years. Her flesh was grey and rotting, but she moved like she was alive. And my son was kissing her decaying lips like she was his bride." The church seemed to grow colder as Elizabeth's words echoed off the walls. Thomas reached for his Bible, but his hands were shaking too badly to hold it steady. "The sisters were conducting it all," Elizabeth continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Eleanor stood at the center, her arms raised to the sky, speaking words in a language that hurt to hear. Margaret was leading the dance, pairing the living with the dead in combinations so obscene I can't speak them aloud. And Ruth, sweet-looking Ruth, was at the edge of the cemetery, digging up fresh graves with her bare hands." Thomas sank into a pew, overwhelmed by the horror of what he was hearing. "Did Samuel see you? Did he recognize you?" Elizabeth's face crumpled. "He looked right at me, Reverend. Looked right at me with eyes black as coal and smiled. Then he said, 'Mother, would you like to dance with Father?' And from behind him stepped my husband who died of consumption 5 years ago, reaching out his skeletal hand to me." The church doors burst open again, and Dr. Hayes rushed inside, his face flushed from running. "Reverend Mrs. Caldwell, thank God you're here. We have a crisis." "What now, Doctor?" Thomas asked, though he wasn't sure he could handle any more revelations. "The cemetery," Dr. Hayes panted. "I've just come from there. Every grave dating back 50 years has been disturbed. The bodies are gone, all of them. But that's not the worst part." He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his coat pocket. "I found this nailed to the cemetery gate. It's an invitation." Thomas took the paper with trembling hands and read aloud, "The citizens of Fairwood are cordially invited to witness the grand resurrection tonight at midnight. Come and be reunited with your beloved dead. Experience pleasures beyond the veil of mortality. The Godfrey sisters promise an evening of eternal ecstasy." "It's signed with what looks like blood," Dr. Hayes added grimly. Elizabeth began laughing again, the sound echoing through the church like broken glass. "Don't you see? They're not just corrupting our town, they're building an army of the dead and the damned." Before anyone could respond, the temperature in the church plummeted. Their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air, and the candles on the altar flickered ominously. From outside came the sound of approaching footsteps, dozens of them, moving in perfect unison. Thomas moved to the window and peered out, his heart stopping at what he saw. The entire population of Fairwood was walking toward the church, but among the familiar faces of the living were others. Faces he recognized from funeral services he had conducted, people he had buried with his own prayers. Leading the procession were the three Godfrey sisters, their beauty now revealed as something terrible and otherworldly. Eleanor's dark hair seemed to move with a life of its own, writhing like serpents around her pale face. Margaret's emerald eyes glowed with an inner fire that cast shadows in impossible directions, and Ruth, sweet Ruth, carried in her arms the severed head of the town's former pastor, Father McKenna, who had died the previous winter. "They're coming for us," Dr. Hayes whispered. The procession stopped at the church steps, and Eleanor stepped forward. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating through the walls and floor of the sacred building. "Reverend Whitmore," she called, "you who speak of resurrection and eternal life, come and witness the true meaning of your words. We have brought your flock together, all of them, living and dead alike." Thomas found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What do you want?" Eleanor's laughter was like the sound of breaking bones. "Want? We want nothing, Reverend. We simply offer what your religion promises, but never delivers. True communion between the living and the dead, pleasure beyond the constraints of mortality, and the chance to experience every sensation the human body can endure, and beyond." Margaret stepped forward, holding up what appeared to be a human heart, still beating in her pale hands. "We offer your congregation the chance to feel what the dead feel, to know what they know, to experience the ecstasy of decay and the pleasure of putrefaction." Ruth raised Father McKenna's severed head, and impossibly, the dead priest's mouth began to move. "Thomas," the head spoke in a voice like grinding gravel, "join us. The dead have so much to teach the living about pleasure, about pain, about the thin line between ecstasy and agony." Mrs. Caldwell suddenly stood and began walking toward the church doors. "Samuel," she called out, "Mother is coming, my darling boy." "Mrs. Caldwell, no!" Thomas lunged forward, but she was already pushing open the doors. The moment she stepped outside, the assembled crowd of living and dead parted to reveal her son Samuel, standing hand in hand with the rotting corpse of his father. The boy's face lit up with an unholy joy as he embraced his mother, and Thomas watched in horror as Elizabeth's eyes immediately turned the same coal-black as her son's. "One by one," Eleanor called out, "you will all join us. Tonight at midnight we will complete the grand resurrection. Every soul in Fairwood, living and dead, will participate in our eternal celebration of flesh and spirit united." As the procession began to move away from the church, heading toward the cemetery, Thomas and Dr. Hayes were left alone in the sanctuary, surrounded by the lingering cold and the echo of unholy laughter. "Doctor," Thomas said, his voice hollow, "I fear we are witnessing the end of everything we hold sacred." Dr. Hayes nodded grimly. "The question is, Reverend, what are we prepared to do to stop it?" Outside, the sun was setting, and midnight was approaching fast. As darkness fell over Fairwood, Sheriff Morrison and Deputy Crawford made their way through the pine forest toward the Godfrey estate, their lanterns casting dancing shadows among the Spanish moss. The air was thick with an unnatural fog that seemed to muffle sound and distort vision, making every step feel like a journey into another world. "Sheriff," James whispered, his voice barely audible above the crunch of dead leaves beneath their feet, "are you certain about this plan?" Morrison checked his revolver for the third time, though he doubted bullets would be effective against what they were about to face. "Certain? Boy, I ain't been certain about anything since those sisters arrived in town, but we can't let them complete whatever unholy ritual they're planning tonight." They had spent the afternoon gathering what weapons and supplies they could find: holy water from Reverend Whitmore's church, silver bullets that Dr. Hayes had somehow procured, and a collection of crosses and religious artifacts. It felt woefully inadequate against the supernatural forces they were about to confront. As they approached the edge of the Godfrey property, the fog began to clear, revealing a sight that made both men stop in their tracks. The entire estate was illuminated by hundreds of candles, arranged in intricate patterns across the grounds. But these weren't ordinary candles. They burned with flames of different colors, deep red, sickly green, and an unnatural blue that hurt to look at directly. "My God," James breathed, "look at the cemetery." Beyond the main house, the old family cemetery had been transformed into an amphitheater of the damned. Every grave had been opened, creating a series of concentric circles around a central altar made from stacked coffins. The missing bodies from the town cemetery were arranged throughout the space, some standing upright as if alive, others positioned in poses that defied both gravity and decency. At the center of it all stood the three Godfrey sisters, no longer bothering to maintain their human facades. Eleanor's skin had taken on a translucent quality, revealing the dark veins beneath like a roadmap of corruption. Margaret's emerald eyes now glowed with their own light, and her hair moved independently of any wind. Ruth appeared the most changed of all. Her youthful beauty had been replaced by something ancient and terrible, her face bearing the marks of centuries rather than decades. "There," Morrison pointed toward the edge of the ritual space, "I can see the townspeople." The living residents of Fairwood stood in a circle around the cemetery, their eyes reflecting the unnatural candlelight. Men, women, and children all swayed in unison to a rhythm that seemed to come from the earth itself. Among them, Morrison could see Sarah Crawford, her face blank and her movements mechanical. "Sarah!" James started forward, but Morrison grabbed his arm. "Wait!" the sheriff hissed. "Look closer!" As their eyes adjusted to the strange light, they could see that the living townspeople were not alone. Each person was paired with a corpse, husbands with their dead wives, children with deceased parents, lovers with long-buried partners. The dead moved with jerky, unnatural motions, but they moved nonetheless, their decaying hands intertwined with the living. Eleanor's voice rose above the scene, speaking in a language that predated human civilization. With each word, the candle flames grew higher and the dead became more animated. Some of the corpses were beginning to show signs of impossible vitality, color returning to gray flesh, wounds healing, eyes opening in skulls that should have been empty. "They're bringing them back," Morrison realized with growing horror. "Not just animating them, actually bringing them back to life." Margaret began to dance around the central altar, her movements hypnotic and obscene. As she moved, the paired living and dead began to mirror her actions, creating a grotesque ballet of the damned. The living participants showed no signs of distress or fear. Instead, their faces bore expressions of rapture and ecstasy. Ruth approached the altar, carrying a large tome bound in what appeared to be human skin. She opened it to a page marked with dried blood and began to read in the same ancient tongue as her sister. With each passage, the ritual grew more intense. "We have to stop this," James said, his hand moving to his weapon. But before they could act, a new horror revealed itself. From the shadows beyond the cemetery emerged more figures, not the recently dead from Fairwood Cemetery, but ancient corpses. Some still wearing the tattered remains of Confederate uniforms, others dressed in clothing that predated the founding of the town itself. "How far back does this go?" Morrison whispered. Eleanor raised her arms, and her voice carried across the night air with supernatural clarity. "Tonight, we complete the great work begun centuries ago. Tonight, the barrier between life and death falls forever. The living shall know the pleasures of the grave, and the dead shall taste again the joys of flesh." The ritual reached a crescendo as Margaret and Ruth joined Eleanor at the altar. Together, they began to chant in harmony, their voices creating harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone present. The effect on the assembled crowd was immediate and disturbing. The living participants began to show signs of physical change, their skin growing pale, their movements becoming more fluid and unnatural. Meanwhile, the dead were becoming more lifelike, their flesh filling out, their eyes brightening with unholy intelligence. They're merging them, Doctor. Hayes's voice came from behind Morrison and James, startling them both. The doctor had approached through the forest, accompanied by Reverend Whitmore. The living and the dead. They're creating some kind of hybrid existence. Reverend Whitmore clutched his Bible tightly, his face pale but determined. This is an abomination beyond anything described in Scripture. We must stop it, whatever the cost. As they watched, the ritual entered its final phase. Eleanor produced an ornate dagger from beneath her robes and approached one of the paired couples, young Timothy Walsh and his deceased mother. With a swift motion, she drew the blade across Timothy's palm, then across the withered hand of his mother's corpse. When their blood mingled, a flash of unnatural light erupted from the contact point. Timothy's eyes rolled back in his head, and when they returned to normal, they held an ancient intelligence that was definitely not his own. His mother's corpse, meanwhile, began to breathe, her chest rising and falling with renewed life. "The exchange is complete," Eleanor announced. "Life and death are now one. The living carry the wisdom of the grave, and the dead taste again the sweetness of mortality." The transformation spread through the crowd like wildfire. Each paired couple underwent the same ritual, creating beings that were neither fully alive nor completely dead. The very nature of existence was being rewritten before their eyes. "Now," Morrison said grimly, "before they complete the transformation of everyone." The four men emerged from the forest, weapons drawn, but they were immediately spotted by Ruth, whose ancient eyes fixed on them with predatory interest. "Ah," she said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "The final participants have arrived. How thoughtful of you to come willingly to your own transformation." See, the hybrid beings that had once been the townspeople of Fairwood turned toward them in unison, their faces bearing expressions of terrible hunger. Among them, James could see his sister Sarah, but her eyes now held the cold intelligence of something that had been dead for a very long time. "Sarah!" he called out desperately. "Fight it! Remember who you are!" The thing that had been Sarah smiled with lips that were too pale, too cold. "I remember everything, brother dear. I remember life, and now I remember death as well. Would you like me to show you how wonderful it is to experience both?" As the hybrid creatures began to advance, Morrison realized that they were not just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for the very nature of life and death itself, and they were vastly outnumbered. The confrontation erupted in chaos as the hybrid beings surged toward the four men. Morrison's first shot rang out across the cemetery, striking one of the transformed townspeople in the chest. The bullet passed through without effect, and the creature continued advancing with that same terrible smile. "The bullets aren't working!" James shouted, firing repeatedly at what had once been the town baker. Each shot found its mark, but caused no damage to the hybrid being. Reverend Whitmore stepped forward, raising his Bible and beginning to recite the Lord's Prayer in a voice that carried across the supernatural din. The effect was immediate. Several of the advancing creatures stumbled, their faces contorting in pain. But Eleanor's laughter cut through the holy words like a blade. "Your God has no power here, priest," she called out, her form beginning to shift and change. Her human facade was melting away, revealing something far older and more terrible beneath. "We have rewritten the very laws of existence. Life and death are ours to command." Dr. Hayes pulled out a vial of holy water and threw it at Margaret, who was approaching from the left. Where the blessed liquid struck her skin, it hissed and steamed, causing her to shriek in rage. But instead of retreating, she seemed to grow larger, more monstrous. "The holy water slows them down," Hayes called out, "but it won't stop them." James found himself face to face with his transformed sister, Sarah. Up close, he could see the horrible truth of what had been done to her. Her skin had the waxy pallor of a corpse, but her eyes burned with an intelligence that was both ancient and alien. "Sarah, please," he begged, lowering his weapon. "I know you're still in there somewhere." The thing wearing his sister's face tilted its head, studying him with predatory interest. "Oh, James, I am still here, but I am so much more now. I have experienced death, felt the cold embrace of the grave, and learned secrets that the living were never meant to know." She reached out with fingers that were too long, too pale, and touched his cheek with impossible gentleness. "Let me share it with you, brother. Let me show you the ecstasy of decay, the pleasure of putrefaction. You'll understand why we chose this gift." James jerked away from her touch, feeling the unnatural cold that radiated from her skin. "This isn't a gift, Sarah. It's a curse. You're not alive and you're not dead. You're something in between, something wrong." Sarah's expression shifted, and for a moment James thought he saw a flicker of his real sister in her eyes. A flash of fear, of confusion, of desperate need for help, but then it was gone, replaced by that terrible ancient intelligence. "Wrong?" she laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "We are evolution, James. We are what humanity was always meant to become. Why cling to the limitations of a single existence when you can experience both life and death simultaneously?" Meanwhile, Morrison and Dr. Hayes had been forced back toward the edge of the cemetery by the advancing horde of hybrid beings. The sheriff's ammunition was running low, and the doctor's supply of holy water was nearly exhausted. "Reverend," Morrison called out, "whatever you're going to do it now." Whitmore had been steadily backing toward the central altar, his Bible held high and his voice never wavering in its recitation of scripture. But as he reached the altar made of stacked coffins, he made a desperate decision. "If they've perverted the natural order," he shouted, "then perhaps we can restore it." He threw his Bible onto the altar and pulled out a small container of oil he used for anointing the sick. With quick, practiced movements, he began to anoint the coffins while reciting the last rites. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The unnatural candles began to flicker and dim, and the hybrid being stumbled as if suddenly weakened. Eleanor let out a shriek of rage that shattered several of the remaining candle flames. "Stop him!" she commanded, but her voice had lost much of its supernatural power. Ruth rushed toward the altar, her ancient form moving with inhuman speed. But Dr. Hayes intercepted her with his last vial of holy water. The blessed liquid struck her full in the face, and she collapsed, writhing in agony as her flesh began to smoke and bubble. "The altar is the source of their power," Whitmore realized. "If we can destroy it, we might be able to break the spell." Morrison understood immediately. He pulled out his last stick of dynamite, something he'd brought as a final resort, and lit the fuse. "Everyone get back." But as he prepared to throw the explosive, Margaret appeared behind him, her transformed state now revealing her true nature. She was no longer remotely human. Her body had elongated into something serpentine, her face had become a mask of scales and fangs, and her emerald eyes blazed with hellfire. "You will not undo our great work," she hissed, her voice now a sound like steam escaping from a kettle. Morrison spun around and threw the dynamite directly at her. The explosion lit up the night sky, and when the smoke cleared, Margaret was gone. But so was a large section of the cemetery, including several of the hybrid beings who had been caught in the blast. The destruction of part of their ritual space seemed to weaken the remaining creatures significantly. Many of the townspeople began to show signs of confusion, as if waking from a dream. The dead, however, began to collapse, their borrowed vitality fading rapidly. Eleanor, now revealed in her true form as something that might have once been human but had long since transcended such limitations, let out a wail of fury that shattered the remaining windows in the estate house. "You have destroyed centuries of work," she screamed, her voice causing the very air to vibrate. "But you cannot undo what has already been done. The barrier between life and death has been weakened. Others will come. Others will finish what we have started." With that, she began to dissolve into shadow and mist, her form becoming insubstantial. "This is not the end," her voice echoed as she faded. It is merely the beginning. Death will have its due, and the living will learn to embrace the grave. As Eleanor vanished, the remaining hybrid beings began to collapse. Some reverted to their human forms, gasping and confused but alive. Others, those who had been too far transformed, simply crumbled to dust, their borrowed existence finally ending. James rushed to his sister Sarah, who had fallen to her knees, her eyes now their normal brown color but filled with terror and confusion. "James," she whispered, her voice weak and human again. "What happened? I remember terrible things, cold things, dead things." "It's over," James said, gathering her into his arms. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, he wasn't sure they were true. The cemetery was in ruins. The estate house was burning from the explosion, and the bodies of the truly dead had returned to their eternal rest. But the memory of what had happened, the knowledge that such things were possible, would haunt Fairwood forever. Dr. Hayes was tending to the survivors, checking their vital signs and trying to understand what had been done to them. Many were physically unharmed, but psychologically shattered by their experiences. Reverend Whitmore stood among the ruins of the altar, his Bible clutched to his chest, tears streaming down his face. "The dead should rest in peace," he murmured. "The living should cherish their time in the light. What we witnessed here tonight was an abomination against the natural order." Morrison surveyed the devastation, his mind already working on how to explain this to the outside world. "We'll tell them it was a gas explosion," he decided. "A tragic accident that destroyed the estate and killed the Godfrey sisters. No one will believe the truth anyway." As dawn broke over Fairwood, the survivors began the long journey back to town. Behind them, the ruins of the Godfrey estate smoldered in the morning light, and the cemetery lay open and empty, its violated graves serving as a reminder of the night when the boundaries between life and death had been shattered. But in the weeks that followed, strange reports began to surface from other towns across Georgia. Stories of empty graves, of the dead walking among the living, of beautiful women who offered pleasures beyond mortal comprehension. Eleanor had been right. This was not the end, it was merely the beginning. The Godfrey sisters had planted seeds of corruption that would spread far beyond Fairwood, and somewhere in the darkness, their legacy continued to grow. The barrier between life and death had been weakened, and it would take more than one night's heroism to repair the damage that had been done. As Sheriff Morrison locked away his report in the deepest drawer of his desk, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had won a battle but lost the war. The dead had tasted life again, and the living had experienced the cold embrace of the grave. And in the shadows of the world, other beings like the Godfrey sisters waited for their chance to complete the great work that had been started in a small Georgia town in 1849. The graves might be empty now, but the hunger for what lay beyond death would never be satisfied.